Hello, and welcome to the Less is More Education podcast with your host, Steve Flores, where I review the research that is most relevant to pedagogy and education policy to help research in their ongoing learning. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. To keep the podcast going, like and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can find me on Instagram and YouTube at lessismore.education or on Patreon at patreon.com/lessismoreeducation. So this is episode 28 and part 2 of my review of the article entitled Motivational Beliefs, Values, and Goals by Jacquelynne Eccles and Allan Wigfield. I highly recommend listening to the previous episode to get the full context of this one. Today's episode is going to be is split up into 3 different parts, integrating expectancy and value constructs, integrating motivation and cognition, and turning the research into meaningful practices for teachers. So let's jump right in to the first part. So what are theories focused on integrating expectancy and value constructs? So there's going to be a few different theories that I go through. The first one is going to be Bernard Weiner's attribution theory, which shifts the focus from expectations of success to internal or external attributions at the individual's perception level. So as an example, when a colleague asks me, well, where are you from? I can take that in a couple of different directions. Number 1, I could see that as like a microaggression, or number 2, I can see it as an invitation to connect at a personal level. Now, how I interpret it is going to be dependent on all of my past experiences that have conditioned me along 3 different causal dimensions, which are the locus of control, the stability, and controllability. So if I've been conditioned to believe that I have an external locus of control, that people only ask that question for a particular purpose, which means that's a stable cause, and that I can't control my emotions, so there's the uncontrollable aspect, I will experience a microaggression, right? But if I wanted to see it as an invitation, then I'd have to change my locus of control to an internal one, and I'd have to have the belief that I am capable of controlling my emotions, right, or my perceptions and interpretations of what I'm receiving. So Weiner also correlated. So the interesting part is he also correlated like attributing failure to internal causes to feelings of shame, whereas failure to external causes as feelings of anger. So if you internalize things that are going on with you, you're going to feel a little bit more shame, but that has a positive aspect in that it gives you a little bit of motivation to want to change things, starting with yourself, right? So if you yourself are feeling shame, then you can change aspects of yourself to stop receiving all that shame, which is a great motivator for changing your behaviors. However, if it's external, right, if things are happening and it's everyone else's fault, not yours, then all that does is make you angry. And anger carries with it motivation to try and attack all the things that made you angry. So it's like if a little kid runs into a table and they get mad at the table and then they want to start hitting the table, right? That's something that happens from time to time. Trust me, I know. I have kids, right? But that's not really helpful, because what that does is it prevents them from being able to see like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be running under the table, right? Or maybe I should keep an eye out as to the level of my head when I'm running around, right? That's more of an internal attribution. Also, what's interesting is how you attribute success. So attributing success to internal causes, right? So these are within me, has been connected to increases in pride and self-esteem, right? So too much of that might give you a bloated head, but self-esteem is necessary for self-efficacy. Whereas externalizing success gives you feelings of gratitude. So what this tends to suggest is that when you're attributing what's making you successful, it might be healthy to attribute it to both kinds of causes, right? To both internal causes and to external causes. And the more you can like kind of broaden your horizons in that way, that starts to help you, A, build a healthy level of self-esteem, and B, it's going to give you a greater sense of gratitude, which has been linked to overall happiness levels. So it's important to have a mixture of both those attributions. So the next theory that we're going to go through is what's called modern expectancy value theory, which was developed by the authors, Eccles and Wigfield. According to what they're trying to do, is they're trying to link achievement, performance, persistence, and choice most directly to individuals' expectancy related and task value beliefs. So the way it looks at it is it views people's decision-making process as being like scale, like on a scale, right? So you have like your costs and benefits kind of thing. And what determines your costs and benefits are going to be according to what's on what are your values, essentially. So if you have a pretty high probability for success, if you do the balancing and you find out, okay, I have a pretty high value of success, then you're going to act out the behavior. In this model, our expectancy beliefs are kind of filtered through our cultural milieu, our perceptions, our goals, and a general self-schemata. So all that sets us up for how we're going to create our value system, right? Then we're going to take that and then do like the more immediate value calculation to try and figure out, all right, if these two things match up, will I act or won't I act? And the subjective task value factor is like this probability factor. And if everything works out in favor, or if overall it's in your favor, then you're going to act out the actual behavior. So what goes into the probability factor? Well, it's determined by 4 different values. The first one is a task's interest or enjoyment value, which is pretty self-explanatory. How much do you like the thing? The attainment value, which are beliefs that you kind of connect to yourself, right? So beliefs about yourself and things that you really value as being aspects of your personality. Utility value, so how useful this thing is, and a relative cost. The behavior is then performed if if you find that all those things work out overall to your failure. Because most things have some kind of a cost associated to it, then the values have to be greater than the cost. So because it relies so much on values, the paper then goes on to cite a guy named Norman Feather and his work on values. So Feather defined values as a set of stable, general beliefs about what is desirable. These values emerge from societal norms and psychological needs. Hey, psychological needs. I talk a lot about that. And there's a Connell and Wellborn psychological needs of autonomy, of mastery or competence, and of relatedness. So values give goals meaning, right? So if there's plenty of goals to be had all around you. Now, how much meaning each one has is connected to where it's connected to your values, right? So for example, if health, right? If you really value your physical health, then working out, having a goal for working out and eating well, those are going to be aligned with one another, and you're going to be more likely to act out those goals because they align really heavily with the things that you value. However, if you have a value of if none of your values include like those health-related aspects, or if those are low on your priority list, having goals set to working out creates this misalignment, and now you're less motivated to do those things, right? And this also applies for goals that maybe don't even like relate to you, right? Like you could set a goal for wanting to be an expert, or photorealistic painter, right? That's a goal to have. And I think that's a good goal to have. But is it the goal that you should have? Is it something that you really value, expressing yourself artistically? If it's not, then then it really doesn't matter. It doesn't really make sense to pursue that. Okay. And so the way I kind of envisioned it is like, imagine that I have a rich friend that invites me to Vegas, and he goes like, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do some gambling, we're going to do some drinking, and we're going to do some hookering, right? I will most definitely say no thanks to any of that. And that's because all those behaviors go against my self-conceptualization as like a caring and loving father and husband, and those are things that I really value. I also value things like honesty and things like, maintaining a balanced lifestyle. So none of those things are really aligned to my values. So I'm going to say, yeah, no thanks. And what informs those values is going to be like my cultural milieu. And so now we're connecting it back to this expectancy value theory from Eccles and Wigfield. So our social milieu kind of comes from our backgrounds. And I like this acronym called WEIRD, which I heard first from Jonathan Haidt, but I think somebody else developed it, which basically describes us as people living in the United States as being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, all right? Now, those are 5 things that are very, descriptive of us in the West. And for a lot of people, not just living in the United States, but in Canada and in Europe, where we tend to be what's called weird, right? All right. And so those, in fact, we grew up in that culture, and then those set up our values, and then we can create goals from those values, as if you're trying to put it like on top of like a hierarchy or an explanatory model. All right. So because my needs and my values don't match up with my rich friend's values, I would have no fun in doing any of that. I can also put it in terms of Wigfield and Eccles, probability factor, right? So would going to Vegas sound interesting or enjoyable to me? Honestly, yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun. Some aspects more than others. I don't really like the gambling and all that, but I kind of like the entertainment and the eating and things along that nature. So, I would be kind of interested in going. Attainment value, that's where I'm going to get like a really negative ding, because I really value honesty and maintaining a family and playing out my role as a father. And that's responsible to my not my students, but to my 2 kids. And so my attainment value doesn't match up. The utility value, that has some utility in that maybe it's going to help me develop a closer relationship with my friend, but that's not a ton of actual utility. And the cost is going to be high, and the cost is going to come back and bite me whether anyone finds out what I did in Vegas or not, because it's all going to be stored in my memory, right? And I'm going to have to deal with this conflict of my behaviors and my values. So pretty high cost, if you ask me. So that makes it totally not worth it. All right. Now, one of the things that the paper does at this point is it introduces this criticism to these types of models that we've been going over so far. And this criticism comes from, I'm going to screw up these names, but I'm going to give it a shot anyways, Baruch Fischoff, Bernard Gotain, and Zur Shapira. And the basic criticism is, people don't really operate like robots, right? So we don't really go in and, see like a possible task that's put in front of us and then go like, all right, what are my values and what are the costs? People more often than not rely on some like intuition to try and just make decisions that are quick, especially if you have time constraints, right? If you have a lot of time constraints, you don't have time to think about your values or how much this is going to cost, or how useful this thing is going to be, right? You're just going to have to use your intuition, make a decision. And so, it's kind of like the difference between using I looked this up. I don't know why I wanted to make a pen analogy, but I did. But it's like making the decision between using this Tibaldi Fulgor Nocturnus black diamond encrusted fountain pen valued at $8 million, or the free pen that you got at the last teaching conference with some combination of the words inspire, achieve, and create printed on it, right? If you had to make a decision and you didn't have a whole lot of time, which pen are you going to use? Well, you're not going to use the one that you store in a lockbox. You're going to use the free one. That's going to give you it's just easier. It's faster. You don't have to go through all this work of trying to maintain a pen as well, or an $8 million pen as well. That's an actual thing, by the way, guys. All right. For anyone that has a spare $8 million lying around. So Eccles and Wigfield argue that the impressive body of research that kind of connects this expectancy and values to different kinds of performance makes these theories still useful. And they also cite that their particular theory includes identity constructs and other unmeasurable characteristics, and that's what kind of gives them their validity. But it's like, yeah, you're introducing a little bit of chaos into your model to kind of explain the things that you can't explain, like intuition. That's another way of saying it. All right. So finally, we get into the Martin Covington's self-worth theory. And this one starts to look more at the mental health side of motivation and achievement. So in this theory, children need self-worth, and academic competence is a proxy for self-worth. So according to Covington, children need to believe they are academically competent in order to think that they have worth as a person in the school context. So let's say that you have a student that's struggling, or that there is a student that's struggling in calculus class. So that student can either attribute their struggles or their failures to lack of ability or lack of trying. Since that student is trying to protect their own perception or self-perception of self-worth or of their own value, what they're going to do is they're going to tell themselves, and maybe the people around them, because there's these external perceptions matter as well, that, I'm failing because I'm just really not trying that hard. I'm not really doing any of the homework. I'm not really doing, And so what they start to do is they start to participate in what are called failure avoiding strategies, right? According to Covington. And so what are these failure avoiding strategies? They're procrastination, making excuses, avoiding challenging tasks, and not trying, right? And this really spoke to me because I read about this initially in the Carol Ames article that I saw earlier, or that I kind of reviewed earlier. And it stood out to me because that's exactly what I was seeing in the classroom, right? Kids that kind of condition themselves, or that believe that they have a low amount of self-efficacy or have a low view of themselves, they just stop trying. And when you just prod them and you give them individualized attention and you say hey, do these things, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3, do them in front of me. I'll tell you if you're on the right path or not. And then they do them, and then they see that they succeed. They are surprised. They're like, what? Is that it? I'm like, yeah, now do it for these other problems, right? And that's because what they've done is they've gotten used to or habituated practicing these failure avoiding strategies for so long that they just move to them automatically. All right. So what he recommends to kind of deal with these failure avoiding strategies, or to even prevent them from happening in the first place, is reducing the frequency and salience of competitive or social comparative and evaluative practices, and focusing instead on effort, mastery, and improvement, which I think there's a lot of value to that, right? So, but I'm kind of conflicted about that piece of advice. Because if you focus a lot on effort, and I think you have to do all three of them, right? Because if you just focus a lot on effort, and students, and I've seen this, students put in a lot of effort and then they seem to be getting nowhere, even though they're putting in all that effort. What that's going to do is that's going to tell them that, oh, like no matter how much effort I can put into this thing, that doesn't matter, right? And I think that's why you got to include mastery, which is showing like little improvements at a time and focusing them on the little improvements, as opposed to having them compare how they're doing to how their table partner is doing or how the other person is doing. And this is why posting up grades is a very bad idea, right? Because even if the grades are posted anonymously, the students get to see like, oh, I'm here and all these people are above me and all these people are below me, right? And then they get to see like, all right, if I'm particularly low, that's going to crush my ability to think of myself as a good student. Now, there is a criticism of this, as pointed out by Eccles and Wigfield, in saying that, self-worth isn't just dependent on your academic performance. Self-worth is also connected, and there's been studies that connect it a lot to your physical appearance and your social competence, right? And not so much on your academic competence. And from my experience in, having kids, seeing small children, seeing how they develop, and then being able to teach and having taught like high school and above, I've seen that what you value changes with time. Like when you're a little kid, you really care about the opinions of the adults and the people that are around you, your teachers and everyone. So academic competence and physical competence, seeing if you can keep up with everyone else, those seem to matter a lot, right? And as you get older, particularly when you start to hit puberty, right, and your body starts to change, your brain starts to change, all those things start to change, then those academic and physical competence stuff, those get devalued, and what starts to take their place is physical appearance and social competence, right? So knowing where you stand in the group and how you look, like your actual physical appearance. And those do take priority over anything else, especially in middle school and early high school. And then some of the students, because kids develop at different rates, so what I saw was towards later high school, like those things were kind of like starting to settle back down, right? Where your physical appearance and your social competence, they just start to like be a little bit devalued, and then other things start to take their place with time. But for the most part, physical appearance and social competence matter a lot to these students. So self-worth isn't just about academic performance. There's all these other things that go into it. So that's it for integrating expectancy and value constructs. Let's go into the next part, which are theories integrating motivation and cognition. And so now we're looking at motivation and how you think about things. So one of the things that you should kind of make a distinction about before we move forward is decision-making versus behavior. Those two things are separate. And if you're a regular gym goer, you see this all the time. Think about, let's say you go to the regular gym, 24-hour fitness. You go like maybe a couple times a week and you go all the time. What inevitably will happen is you're going to show up in January, and then all these people that were never there before just start showing up. And then it starts to get packed, and then you're like, I don't even have like access to my regular equipment and all that. And then by February, March, you just see all those people disappear. And then they don't come back again until the next winter, right? And then so it gives you true meaning to winter is coming, right? It's like, oh, the horde of people that have made New Year's Eve resolutions are going to come in. And so New Year's Eve resolutions are an example of making a decision. All right, I'm resolving myself to doing this thing. The actual behavior of going to the gym, that's a whole nother category of things. That's not the same thing as making the decision. Even though you've made the decision, your decision may have not changed. By the time March and February start, or February and March start to come by, because things aren't in alignment, or maybe because you pushed yourself too hard, you burn yourself out, then you become demotivated and you stop attending. And then there's the effect on behavior. Okay. So the first one that I found, or the first theory that they go over, is Barry Zimmerman's self-regulated student, which is a really interesting theory because it's based on observations on really highly effective learners. So Zimmerman really focused on, all right, what are the kids that are doing really, really well? What kinds of things do they do? What are their aspects and all that? So let's go into there. So what he said is basically they are metacognitively, motivationally, and behaviorally active at all times, right? And they go through their learning processes and try to achieve a wide variety of goals. And again, this variety of goals keeps coming back, right? Because if you listen to the last episode, we talked about academic versus pro-social goals and how having a combination of those goals is what really seems to matter. So now we're starting to see through lines and trends through all these things. All right. So he's basically looking at like the top students, the perfect students. And a key factor that comes out of what he's talking about is you can't really make a perfect student until you give them freedom and choices. Because you can't be behaviorally or motivationally active and even metacognitively active if everything is being handed to you in like a very scripted form. You have to be able to make decisions in order to exercise these abilities. So if you take a self-regulated student and you put them in a really restrictive environment, then all of a sudden you start to see their grades start to plummet. All right. So what this is an argument basically against rigid curriculums where you go like, all right, we're going to go chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, or we're going to cover these things and these things and these things. And these are the assignments that you have to do because there's no choice in there. And because there's no choice, then the students themselves can't have the practice of regulating themselves. It's just like, oh, everything, I just got to do all these things. And in some of my previous interviews that you'll see is that and my own experience has been that when I was in the extremely restrictive environment, like I went to Catholic school, and then I got taken out of that environment and I went to a regular college, state college, then, I start floundering and being lost and not knowing what to do because I never had the practice of freely making decisions for myself that mattered. So being able to choose really, really matters. And so what you're doing is you're switching it from a rigid curriculum to making it more of the responsibility of the student to learn. Now, a lot of these strategies, so these students will engage in a bunch of different activities, including engaging in a variety of strategies that involve agency and purpose. They believe themselves to be efficacious, so they have a lot of self-efficacy. They will set many and various kinds of goals for themselves. And they go through this cycle of observing themselves, evaluating their actions, and then modifying their behavior so that they're constantly improving. So that's what he means that they're active. They're proactive about who they are as students or whatever it is that they're doing. Zimmerman then went on to work with Dale Shunk to draw connections between self-efficacy and self-regulation. And so Shunk demonstrated how if you have proximal, specific, and challenging goals, then students tend to be more motivated than if they don't. And this is actually like the origin story of SMART goals. So if you're in education, you probably have heard of SMART goals. And those are goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So SMART there for you guys. And so long as they have all those 5 different aspects, then they tend to be a little bit more motivating. So they're specific, so you know exactly what to do. Measurable, which means that you can track your progress. attainable, which is like you have to kind of understand yourself and where you can achieve or not achieve, and being honest about that. Relevant, which is they have to matter to you. So, and then there's where you start to talk about aligning your goals to your values or whatever your values are. And they have to be time bound, because if they just kind of go on forever, eventually you just kind of get bored with it, right? So you got to always assess it with time. All right. And so he was able to show that Shunk was also able to show that learning goals rather than performance goals reinforce rather, Shunk was able to show that self-efficacy was higher in students who focused on learning goals rather than performance goals. Okay, so what that basically means is that if you remember back from Eccles, which was in the last episode, I talked about ego-involved versus task-involved goals. This is basically the exact same thing. So if you're learning to learn, so if your goals are, you're trying to learn something and all your goals center around how to learn this one thing better and better, that's what we would call a learning goal or a task-involved goal. If you're learning something because you want to get something out of it, like it's like more of like a secondary goal, or you're trying to like prop yourself up as something, right? Like I want to get an A, because I want to be seen as like the best student in the class. That's a whole different category of goals. So those aren't as effective for education. So there have been many theories that attempt to link motivation and cognition, but a lot of them have kind of failed at kind of connecting these two things. And so there was one goal that they talk about in the article one model proposed by Paul Pintrich, which linked cognition, motivation, and social context. And so what Pintrich did with Elizabeth DeGroot is that they were able to show that a student's self-efficacy with the use of cognitive and self-regulation strategies predicted their engagement and achievement. So another way of putting it is that students with the proper mindset tend to have better academic achievement, right? So if you are thinking correctly and if you are capable of regulating yourself, then you will be successful. So how much of that is inherent and how much of that is can be learned? That's the big question, right? And so honestly, I don't know. I'm going to have to look that up, right? So that's an interesting idea, though. But we'll talk about a little bit more about this later on when it talks about like traits, okay? So along that, let's talk about motivation and volition. So those two things are not the same, right? So motivation is like setting the goal. Volition is the behavior. It's the actual doing of the thing. And so there's a researcher called Lynn Corno who wrote a paper called The Best Laid Plans, Modern Conceptions of Volition and Educational Research, which I highly suggest everyone reads, or I'll probably review it at some point as well. And what she says is volition is a combination of will and diligence, as well as aptitudes, cognitive processes, and self-regulation strategies, right? So it's not just that you have the ability and the willpower to do it, it's that you also have the techniques to be successful as well. So Julius Kuhl, Kuhl, articulated volitional practices into a series of strategies, including volitional, cognitive control, emotional control, motivational control, and environmental control. And those are like the different categories or the different like strategies that you can kind of use to propel yourself forward, to do some kind of an action. Corno later came back and took a look at that list, and she focused on emotional and motivational control because those two things were the most highly related to or predictive of academic performance. So emotional control strategies are anything that can inhibit anxiety and depression, and motivational control strategies are anything that strengthen your intent when it is weakened, right? So my reading of these things actually brought back all these ideas of the big 5 personality traits. So if you don't know what the big 5 personality traits are, it's like these, you can take a test online. There's plenty of them. Just type in big 5 personality test and they'll tell you a lot about yourself. And the 5 aspects are extroversion, right? So extroversion, how extroverted versus introverted are you? Agreeableness, so you can be agreeable or disagreeable. Openness, and that's openness to new ideas. Conscientiousness, and that is more of how efficient or organized you are as a person. And neuroticism, which has a lot to do with your emotional control. And that's how much negative affect the world around you or the environment around you gives you. So if you're very neurotic, then the environment affects you a lot. If you're not, then it affects you very little. And from my reading of this is that it seemed to me that the 2 traits that were most important were conscientiousness and neuroticism. So conscientiousness is how organized you are, and that translates directly into your like organization, right? So your ability to apply strategies in order to keep yourself like all organized. And then neuroticism was more about your emotional control. So that maps directly onto your emotional control strategies. So if you are low on neuroticism, you probably are better at applying these emotional strategies. And and you're also probably be better at motivating yourself when your motivation gets low. As far as how to do that, well, that's going to be for a future episode. All right. So finally, Wigfield and Eccles, what they decided to do is like, all right, they looked at all this information. They're like, all right, how can we integrate some of this into our expectancy value model of motivation? And they said that self-regulation has more to do with goals than with values. So because goals exist on a hierarchy, to understand motivation, you must understand the components of the hierarchy. So importance, utility, and interest all influence where a goal rests on the hierarchy. So the goal hierarchy was integrated into the expectancy value model through what's called the subjective task value component of the model. And this subjective task value is kind of like is the 4 aspects that I talked about earlier. So is it attainable? How interested are you in it? How much utility does it have? And what's the cost? So they're saying like that and your strategies to your cognitive strategies to regulate yourself are basically the same thing, which that feels like it could be debated. It feels like it got kind of stapled on top of it. All right. Now, last part is how do we turn all this research into meaningful practices for teachers? So one of the things that that stood out to me is like as these models get more and more complicated and more complex, sure, they might be able to explain more, but their usefulness in terms of what you can do with them in the classrooms tends to start to go down. But their implications for what they mean for a school site level tend to start to go up. And, we'll talk about like changing like school systems to kind of fit motivation later on in a future episode. And so now, if you look at all these strategies, 2 things start to precipitate out, or 2 concepts start to precipitate out that are commonalities amongst all of these theories. The first one is building self-efficacy nurtures motivation. That seems to be true in every theory, right? So if you feel like you're capable, then you're going to be more motivated to act. Now, it's important to note that self-efficacy is very like task specific, right? So you might be very self-efficacious in your math class, but not so much in your English class. But you can build the self-efficacy with time. The second thing is aligning values, goals, and behaviors is what encourages motivation. When there's a misalignment, that's when you start to see motivation go down. Because you might have a goal, and if you don't really care about that goal, well, then the amount of effort that you're going to put into it is going to be little or small. All right. So let's talk about cake, because I like cake, right? And I'm a little bit hungry right now. So believing one can bake a cake and expecting to be able to bake a cake are kind of like two sides of the same coin. So there's a lot of self-efficacy and performance expectations, but they are kind of the same thing, right? Because if you are very efficacious, then of course you're going to expect to do well, right? And both of those things lead to a higher probability that you'll bake a cake, right? If you already expect to bake a cake and if you believe you're capable of doing it, right? Or have the skills to do so. So attribution theory, modern expectancy value theory, and self-worth theory all agree that expectations of positive outcomes and your self-efficacy are what are going to lead to academic achievement. So the big question becomes, how do you cultivate self-efficacy and positive expectations? So the key idea here is going to be patience and going through the reflection process, right? So those two things are crucial to building your motivation. So let's say that you want your students to be self-efficacious bakers. Well, what you do is you start off with one concept, like we're just going to practice building a cake or making a cake. And what you're not going to do is just give them the recipe, give them all the ingredients, give them all the tools and go like, all right, good luck, figure it out, right? Because that's not going to be helpful to the students. That's not going to build their self-efficacy. What you need to do is you need to come up with a plan, right? And the plan could be, all right, I'm going to take the steps to baking a cake and I'm going to break them up into like these smaller chunks, and I'm going to have the students practice each chunk, right? So students need to know how to, like here's one thing, measure ingredients out using measuring spoons or a measuring cup. They need to know how to do that. They also need to know that if you're baking a cake, you should probably mix all the dry ingredients together, all the wet ingredients together, and then mix those together. So that's already 3 different steps right there. How do you mix wet ingredients? How do you mix dry ingredients? How do you mix them together? How do you put them in the oven? Like what kind of a dish do you use? So you can break it up into all these different steps. Next, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to give the students like a way of knowing that they're doing well, right? So what you can do is you can have like pictures or images for how final products should look like. So if you mix dry ingredients together, then it should have a normal consistency. It should be around this color, and you can show them a picture, or you can do it in front of them in front of the class, and then have them compare their trials to what you've done until they feel comfortable with where they're at, and they go like, okay, I feel like I can do this step. Now I can move on to the next step. Now, because students are going to achieve at different rates, it's going to be important to kind of like set them up for success and allow them to move forward if they feel like they've mastered a step, or take more time if they feel like they haven't mastered it yet. And so this makes things a little bit more difficult to do in the classroom. But if you just allot a holistic time and set a deadline going like, okay, we're going to do this, bake a cake, and we want this done by Friday. So we're going to start on Monday. Here's the whole plan, right? And I'm going to do this step on Monday, this step or these steps on Tuesday, on Wednesday, on Thursday, on Friday. And then by Friday, we're going to put them all together, right? And so as students regulate themselves, some of the students are going to be, better at doing the dry ingredients than the wet ingredients. Some of the students are going to be better at or faster at mixing the 2 sets of ingredients together. Some students are going to be faster at measuring, right? But they might be slower in a different part. And so it'll work out so long as you have like insufficient amount of time so that they can all get to the final product by Friday. And what you need, and so now that you have it broken up into steps, giving them some kind of a guide so that they constantly reflect on it is going to be really helpful at this point too. Because if you think about the cycle of learning, it's going to be, okay, I'm going to act, then I'm going to observe myself, then I'm going to evaluate myself, then I'm going to modify my behavior, right? So that's the cycle that the self-regulated student does. And you have to give them opportunities and choices to do that. So if they have a list and they can check off, all right, I've mastered this, now I can move on to the next one. I can check that off. As they progress through the week, they can see, oh, I'm progressing and that I'm making improvements. And that's what builds their self-efficacy, right? Because you're actively showing them that they can do each step. You just showed them a technique, but they actually practice it, do it, and then they become confident at it. And they're constantly seeing their progress. Now that they've seen their progress, they can modify and see like, all right, can I do this better or worse? And you can even slow down students that are going fast by telling them like, hey, I see that you've completed these. Can you do this step better, right? Can you improve upon your past? And that gets them into practicing those and lets them decide like, all right, how good does this need to be? Okay, now, if you do this process and you bake a cake and then you do the process again and you make some cupcakes and then maybe you make some muffins and then maybe you make some cookies using the same basic techniques, then what you're going to start to do is you're going to build self-efficacy in the domain of baking. And then when a new challenge comes over to the students, hey, can you bake, well, X or Y? Then they can fill in the blank and go like, all right, yeah, I think I can because I've already had experiences baking all these other types of things. And you can think of your classroom as being like that, right? So if you want them to be good at any topic, any unit, any chapter, break it up, have them practice each step, and show them that they can do it, right? And give them choices as to like their speed. Can I move forward or should I not move forward? But you got to give them a guide so that they know whether or not they can. All right. Now, because you need like a solid recipe, there is a book that I want to recommend over here. They're not, giving me any money or anything, but it's called Learning Targets, Helping Students Aim for Understanding in Today's Lesson by Connie M. Moss and Susan Brookhart. So, if you guys are watching on YouTube, I'm holding it up now. It's a really good book, and what it does is it makes a distinction between learning objectives and learning targets. And learning objectives or student objectives are things that you as a teacher need to kind of keep track of to make sure that you're progressing throughout the year, right? These are all the things that that are connected to your standards or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish throughout the year. Learning target is different because it's from the perspective of the student. And it's something that you're going to give the students so that they understand what they need to do and how they're going to know whether or not they've accomplished what they need to do so that they can move forward. So you got to have like a basic plan. And you also got to have like constructive feedback. So you can facilitate this process by constantly like walking around, giving feedback to students, asking students how they're doing, asking them like hey, does this look like this? What do you think? Right? And giving them like reinforcement when they start to make progress, especially for the students that are struggling. Those are the ones that need the most reinforcement, right? You can go like, hey, look, you made it through step 4 today. Awesome. Keep it up, right? Like you can do it. Like you should be able to make it by the end of the week. Right? And giving them that encouragement so that they can feel this sense of self-efficacy and relatedness to you as well. And then it also shifts the attribution of success from unstable to stable causes, right? So if they know like, every time I do this, it leads to this, then their attribution starts to become more and more stable, right? Because they know that if X is done, Y will happen. If they have unstable attributions, then Y will happen and they won't know what caused Y. So thinking of feedback in those terms of like, this leads to this, this leads to this, this leads to this, and giving it into that format, that's what helps the students understand like how to improve, right? Because you're making that causality happen. All right. And that seems to be very, very critical to having them be able to reflect and be better. All right. So the next part, and that is aligning values, goals, and behaviors. So here's a question. What are your values? If that question makes you uncomfortable, then you're not alone. A lot of people have a hard time articulating what their values are. It's a punishing question to answer honestly, and to really answer honestly, like what are your values as opposed to what are the expectations out of you, right? And those two things aren't completely separate from one another. But we have a hierarchy of values because we cannot act unless we have a hierarchy of values, right? And, think about any decision that you have to make. You're going to set up, you have some value system to make that decision. Now the hierarchy of values might be subconscious. It might be something that you don't really think about, right? So my choosing to drive a minivan, that was a highly conscious decision because I'm like, okay, here's what I need. I need a lot of utility and I need X amount of gas mileage and it shouldn't cost me an arm and a leg. So I have all these requirements and I go okay, now I can make a decision on which one to buy, right? And there's some other things that you kind of rely a little bit more on intuition, right? So what should I have for breakfast today? I don't know, right? Like that one you can go if you don't have enough time, it might be cereal because that's just the easiest thing and the quickest thing to make at the time. All right. Now, most theories discuss or refer to values indirectly through goals, right? And goals and values are kind of connected together because values give meaning to your goals. But when goals aren't properly calibrated to your values, that's when you start to have erratic behaviors or unmotivated behaviors. So the more misaligned these three components are with one another, the less motivated students and people more generally will be. So Eccles and Wigfield classify values as interest, enjoyment, attainment, utility, and relative cost. So these values are not created equal, but they are kind of interdependent within each other. And I think, personally, attainment values have the greatest, I guess they have the ability to stand strongly at the top of our hierarchy, right? But they aren't automatically put there. And because these are values that are core to our beliefs about ourselves. And those, because it's so personal, they have the highest potential of all the other sets of values. And I can give you an example of this, right? So, I heard a lot of war stories from my brother because he, did a couple of tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he saw a lot and came back with a lot of stories. And one of the things that stood out to me is that a soldier will lay down his life for another soldier. And what that means, if you think about it in terms of these four categories of values, right? That means that what they did is they set loyalty and valor above all other values, because that's the only way you can really sacrifice your life to save the lives of others. And other people do this too. You think about your firefighters, think about, police officers. There are people out there that are willing to sacrifice even their own life. And what that means is that value, that attainment value, is greater than any interest or enjoyment value that they could have. Because if they carry through with that value, they will no longer get to enjoy their interests, right? And that's deep. That means a lot. And it also is more valuable than any utility value that can possibly exist, right? Because if you give up your life to carry out a value, then there is no more thinking about utility. And that value is greater than the cost of death, which is really deep and really meaningful right there. Now, how are soldiers able to do this? Well, they're trained to do so, right? they're trained to have a lot of loyalty within their comrades at arms, and they're trained to have a lot of valor through their culture, right? Through the combatant culture. And so this, because they think about it, and because they've internalized it, and because they're in the culture of it, they are made conscious those values, and then they put them up at the top of the hierarchy. And that, if that can motivate you to sacrifice your own life, then that has the greatest capability, is, what I think of that. And in our lives, when we don't have a whole lot of conscious thought about our values, like it's not a part of their curriculum. If you do have any information on values or how to put them onto a hierarchy, it's probably coming from home or through church or through, some other organization that you're a part of. But most people aren't a part of that, and most of our students don't have those things. And so what we need to do is we need to start thinking about incorporating these conversations of values with our students, because this is what could, if you put the correct things at the top of the value hierarchy, you can create very motivated students, right? So it's going to be important to start talking to your students about values, right? And asking them questions that kind of help them think about their values. And because your values are going to be, give meaning to your goals, once you have the proper set of values, then you can start talking about goals. And then once you have the proper goals, then you can start talking about behaviors. And if all three of those things are kind of aligned with one another, then you can get highly motivated students. And I saw this play out in my class all the time. I would have students that would come, they're demotivated, they don't know why they're there. They're there because they have to be. And then I just, start having conversations with them. And I ask them, like, well, what kind of a person do you want to be? Right? And I will give them ideas. Like, look, do you want to be somebody who's highly motivated or not? Right? Do you want to be somebody that can accomplish things or not? Do you want to be somebody that, that is willing to make sacrifices today for bigger rewards in the future? Or not, right? And if you start asking deep questions of these to your students, they'll respond, especially if you've built a rapport with your students. And these were the conversations that I loved the most and that I missed the most of having with my students was, hey, what type of a person do you want to be, right? Not just right now, but in the future as well. What really matters to you? And then you can even connect it to, social aspects. Don't just make it about academics, right? And go like, oh, what kind of a student you want to be. You also got to go like, all right, who do you want to be in your group, right? Like, who do you want, like, what can you contribute to other people around you, right? Do you want to be somebody that can cooperate? Do you want to be somebody that has the ability to share their ideas? What type of person do you want to be? Like, do you want to be somebody that is perceived as helpful? Do you want to be somebody that's perceived as caring? So who is it exactly that you want to be? And incorporate those things into yourself. Now that you can incorporate into it, now you can start setting goals. And you can start asking, and once they understand their values and they've written them out, now they can start assigning goals to their values. And some of these goals will kind of, you should be accepting of all goals. Like examples, right? It is possible to have goals that, that read like this. Like, I want a C in chemistry, or I want to turn in one homework assignment a week in math class, or once a week I want to help my table partner clean up the desks, or I'm going to be honest with my group about how much I can contribute to the group project, right? Like, you got to remember that these aren't your goals. These are your students' goals, and students need somewhere to start. before they can start becoming better and better students, right? And it's good to have a mixture, and this is what Wenzel pointed out. You got to have a mixture between pro-social and pro-academic goals if you want academic achievement and sustainable academic achievement, right? And once they have these goals, right, and they've set them for themselves, and you have them constantly reflect on their goals, then they're on the path to constant improvement and continual improvement, right? Because goals will get boring with time. And that's because you've accomplished them, or you've set out to incorporate some kind of a habit, and now you have it. Now you need a bigger challenge and a bigger challenge and a bigger challenge and a bigger challenge. And this builds exponentially, right? It can start with, I want to do one homework assignment a week, right? And after 2-3 weeks, they're down, they do it automatically. Now it's going to be, 2 or 3, right? Or 4 or 8. And it doesn't take that long before they're doing all their homework. But they got to start somewhere, and it has to be small, and it has to be attainable, right? And it has to be specific to the students. And when you set this up in terms of the students, and you focus on the students themselves and having them come up with these things, then you start to see a lot of self-motivated behavior. And then now all you have to do as a teacher is build rapport with them, so that when you say, hey, are you living up to your goal right now? Are you being honest with how much you can contribute to the group, right? How are you doing with that homework assignment? Are you actually doing it? Then they know, like, okay, Mr. Flores has my back. They're trying to help me meet my own goals, right? They actually care about me. And that is like very, very powerful. And and I hope that if you don't do these things, that maybe you consider incorporating them, because they matter a lot. And there seems to be a lot of research that shows that. Thank you very much.